I want to start this conversation just by expressing how remarkable this movie is. I'm a big fan of movies and documentaries that like inspire discussion and debate, and I think this movie does just that. And so I want to congratulate you guys on the film and it going out to the world, and of course screening at the Vancouver International Film Festival. So
Very exciting. Thank you for those words. Yeah, we're really excited that it is provoking conversation.
for those who are just discovering the film, can you give a synopsis about what the mission is about?
Sure. The mission is about John Chau. The starting point is a young missionary, an American missionary named John Chau, who in 2018 went to the island of North Sentinel, which is off the coast of India, very remote. And he went to convert an indigenous community that lives there. They're called the Sentinelese. And he was killed as he set foot on the island. And his death sparked a global conversation. Who was John Chau? Who is this tribe who lives in this remote island that we know almost nothing about? And our film goes sort of behind the headlines to tell John's story and the story of this island and this people.
Yeah, very, very fascinating story. The mission had its world premiere at Telluride, correct? So about a month ago, it was introduced to the world. But as far as I can tell, there's local ties to Vancouver. Can you talk about the connection that the mission has to Vancouver and maybe the relevance to Vancouver audiences?
Well, is to the Pacific Northwest. It's actually Vancouver, Washington.
Oh, am I getting that mixed
Vancouver,
up? It's so funny because I heard Vancouver, Washington in the movie, and I was like, oh, are they going between both? So my apologies, yeah. Vancouver, Washington.
We can say the Pacific Northwest. I don't know. Do you consider yourselves part of the Pacific Northwest?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, Washington, DC, this is all Pacific Northwest. So yes, it's Pacific Northwest film. So yes, Vancouver, Washington. Talk about more the local to Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
So John Chau was born and raised in Vancouver, Washington. But and I think a huge part of his life story, which we get into in the movie, is his outdoor life. He really, from a very early age, was an enthusiast, an outdoorsman, a biker, a hiker. All the wonderful things are available to people in the Pacific Northwest. He was enchanted with that as that was part of his childhood.
Well, he loved to test his strength as a young man. I think part of what drew him to the island of North Sentinel was it was a test. What was the most dangerous missionary work you could do in the world? He was a guy who challenged himself on mountain summits, and he picked the hardest thing he could do as a young missionary, the most difficult, the most dangerous thing.
And in fact, I think that he felt that was why he was the right person for this particular job, because he'd been putting himself to the test as a mountaineer, as a, camp, all that stuff. So a missionary and able to go to faraway places.
I think that that's such an interesting component to this movie, and maybe if we hang out and have a beer or two, we could talk more about the Messiah complex that comes up in the film. For now, I'll leave that topic as something that audiences can discuss among themselves. But yes, that spirit of adventure is certainly a Pacific Northwest thing. The spirit of challenging yourself. I think a lot of Pacific Northwest residents and citizens really connect with that. But another big component of this film, obviously, is religion and Christianity, which, again, so much to discuss with that. But I was so curious about your own backgrounds and how your either religious affiliation or religious abstinence, whatever your background is, impacted and influenced how you approach this film.
Yeah, great question. I didn't grow up in a religious family. In fact, I didn't really go to church ever until I was about 42, and I ended up stumbling my way into a church in North Dakota and making a movie there called The Overnighters. It's about a Lutheran pastor who opens the doors of his church to shelter homeless job seekers in the North Dakota oil field. And that for me was the beginning of what I would call my religious education, this religious journey that I've been on to understand the way faith is lived, and radical faith, how people don't just preach, but actually practice their faith. And John's story is an extension of that inquiry for me. We live in a very religious world. Our country is divided between the secular and the religious. And I think that we've always prided ourselves in making films that are about cultures and communities that are different from our own. So I want to understand how people live their faith. What bearing does that have on my life? And that's part of what this film is a conversation about living your faith.
Yeah, Amanda, how about you?
I also grew up, I still am secular. And so I think part of my interest in this story was a continuation of all these projects that we've been doing about radical faith. And, who is this person who wanted to make contact with an uncontacted tribe? Like, why would somebody be compelled to do that? Something I really don't understand. And so I think part of it was that, but quickly spun into who is this uncontacted tribe? How is that possible in 2023? So there's so much. John was sort of the thread that, and then you pull on that, and suddenly we're talking about a lot of things that are very relevant and universal to me, questions that we're all asking ourselves.
It's so interesting. I got to watch this movie with the background of having grown up Christian, and there's so many things about, John's life, his lifestyle, his social group, and that community that I recognize. I don't have a religious affiliation now, so I had this very unique perspective of being able to watch the movie from both angles, and that's what makes this such a fascinating film for me, because I see both sides. I agree with one side more than the other, but that kind of leads me to my next question. Having screened the film, are you finding that this is a polarizing kind of movie?
I think it's provoking conversation, which is what we hope. I think it's challenging people who think John is a martyr to come to this film, and they're going to be challenged because the portrait that is presented is asking them questions. What does it mean to impose your religion, your culture on another community? And I think that's a question now in our history we are really asking ourselves. I think if you're convinced that John Chau was a fool and misguided, I think the film will also provoke and force you to ask questions about yourself, because John actually subscribed to two religions, the religion of his Christian faith, but also of adventure. We talked about that, of exploration. And he took in stories like Tintin and Robinson Crusoe that many of us read, and actually have messages that I think we are now recognizing and grappling with, in some cases, misguided messages that have been part of a colonial narrative and our colonial history that we're scrutinizing. And I think John's embrace of those stories, we also embrace. And I think it's forcing us to think about the stories that if we're not Christian, the stories that sort of guide us.
This is a very interesting topic. Something I was talking with a friend of mine who's also seen the film about it, and just kind of like, having these conversations and asking these questions and getting each other's perspective on it. And I made a statement that I had to stop and think about. I said, man, the only belief, because the idea that he's going to like push these beliefs onto these people, at least is how some people might see John's actions. And so I look at this and I think, man, the only belief that I really want to push onto people is to not push beliefs onto people. And then I had to stop and think about it. I had to stop and think about that, right? Like, what makes my intentions any more virtuous than what his were, or any missionary's work? And so the question that leads me to is, for this documentary, what do you think about this not just being a window into John's life, John's choices, but also a mirror onto any of us that have strongly held beliefs that we think others would benefit from sharing?
You know what? You're raising a great point, and thank you for doing that, which is, I think that as someone who found his way to a church, I've been moved deeply by sermons. And I think that the film, if I can think about it in one way, is a kind of sermon that invites an audience to think about the world they live in and about how they live their life. And I think those are the best sermons. They don't tell you to believe this way or that way. The teachings are presented and open to interpretation. And I think that's what we've strived to do, is to create a space where a community can come together and be challenged and provoked and think about the world they live in, maybe a little bit differently. So I've never thought about I do sometimes think about documentary as a kind of spiritual practice, but I haven't thought about my work as, religious. But I do think that I'd love to. I mean, you've talked about that.
Often there are morality tales, right? There's a person, there's ethics, there's all kinds of stuff that we're exploring, and that's definitely happening in this film. We're trying to make sense of why we were fascinated by the story in the news, and where it took us in our adventure of trying to unpack that or contextualize either John or the Sentinelese was really surprising and great, and all the people we met and their reflections on their own versions of going to whatever their island was. But I think, people come to this film with such different perspectives, right? And I love that they're bringing that part of themselves, whether it's their religious upbringing or or many other aspects of their life story, or how they feel about any kind of adventure, any kind of active discovery. I like that there's passionate response on either side. I like that there's those conversations of difference. I don't think you don't hear our point of view in this film. I think it's pretty clear towards the end, but I do feel like we give people enough space to kind of feel their way through each chapter of what the history is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, lots of themes to take away from the film and lots of ways to perceive it. I can't wait for more people to see it so that I can have more conversations. I want to talk about the style of the film a little bit, because there is a creative choice in the movie to do like animated reenactments, which I loved. It actually kind of reminded me, I don't know if you guys saw the documentary Flea, but it reminded me a lot of that. But like, tell me more about how the stylistic approach to telling the story, the animated reenactments, and all of that.
Yeah. We love Flea, and we're inspired by new forms of nonfiction storytelling, where we have primarily made cinema verite documentaries. But in this case, we were first inspired by the stories that John himself took in, Tintin, comic books, movies, kids' tales. And it seemed, in searching for a language to bring John's story to life on screen, that animation was sort of uniquely suited to convey and capture some aspect of John, that he was enchanted by stories and a victim of that enchantment in a way. I think he imagined that he could succeed as the boyhood protagonists of these movies that he loved always survived, and perhaps was misguided, right, in thinking and naively that he could triumph. And so I think we looked at those stories and gave ourselves permission, and we love the form. I think it's also subjective. It doesn't present itself as the objective truth. I think the film is about also the issue of representation, how we have depicted this other culture, sometimes harmfully. And I think we were particularly sensitive to not falling into a trap of trying to cast the Sentinelese, some people who are not them, to portray them. That felt not appropriate. And I think it also allows the audience to bring a bit more of themselves to an interpretation of what they're seeing. It doesn't say, this is what happened. It says, this is...
It's our imagining
of
it.
Yeah.
And that's very clear when you're working with animation.
Mm-hmm. It's much harder than we realized, and takes much more time, and frankly costs a bit more money. And
so slow.
But we were, one of the great joys of filmmaking is collaborating with other artists, and our animation team are they're brilliant artists. They helped bring that to life and work with us patiently. And also we were able to anchor that very emotional story of Patrick Chau, grieving for his son through animation. Patrick wasn't comfortable being on camera, but did share that letter with us. And so bringing that to life and his relationship and connection to John through animation was, I think, something we could also do through that form and give shape to the story.
I mean, this is this is a very personal movie. The subjects that you talk to are, very close to John. There's those personal connections, and it seems, I don't know, I like approaching a topic like this can be uncomfortable, and having those conversations, asking hard questions. Tell me more about your approach in like helping these subjects be comfortable with telling the story, but also your own comfort level with like exploring what happened through these perspectives.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to steal a line from Amanda, which is, let the world be your teacher. And I think documentary filmmaking is really a lot about listening and patience and going with an open heart. It's kind of what I learned to check my cynicism when I started this film 10 years ago about this pastor. And I think we tried to bring that to this conversation, and why I'm really happy that people close to John in the Christian community and his evangelical community did agree to speak to us. And I think we hopefully let the audience be the judge, but gave them a fair hearing. They helped us understand where John came from and who he was. And I think that one of the achievements of the film, I'd like to think, is its respectfulness. But as Amanda said, without suspending our own judgment, because we're human and we have feelings too. We're not trying to hide them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Amanda, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's also working with the intimacy of the diary and the intimacy of the dad's letters. I mean, as parents, there's a certain connection I'm going to make to those words, and how I can't even imagine the pain of losing your child, but also losing even before what happened at the island, just losing your child over a period of 10 years to a radical form of faith that, Patrick is also a man of faith, but they had theological differences. And that sort of really, once we had those letters and we had those, it sort of felt like it felt like a real human conversation in a way that the film kind of opened up. In the next phase of the film opening up was meeting Dan Everett and getting the perspective of a missionary who really walked the walk on the radical level that John was attempting, right? And then another unlocking of a door that really made me feel like this film could achieve liftoff was that National Geographic was willing to look at themselves because they were complicit in some way, specifically related to this story, having done an article on the Sentinelese in the 70s. So all of those pieces kind of made it dimensional in a way that I got really interested in. So
absolutely. I'm gonna bring this to a close here in a moment, but I do want to know more about, if you can say anything about the future of this film. Can you talk about festivals that it's going to? I actually know there's it's already been announced that it'll play Orcas Island Film Festival, obviously Vancouver. Tell me about the future of the film and maybe when people can see it.
Yeah, so we have a robust festival engagements this fall. There'll be lots of opportunities for people in the Northwest and around the country to see the film, and then it'll open in theaters starting in New York and Los Angeles on October the 13th and expanding wider theaters. That's exciting for us, and we're going to be traveling to Europe and sharing it with at the BFI London Film Festival and other festivals. So we think it's hopefully a global conversation, but also a local conversation. And if there's a church that wants to invite us to come and talk or share the film, we're all ears. We'd be excited to do that. And I think it's just hopefully the beginning of the conversation.
No, that's really cool. And the fact that I think that this movie has something to say to anyone who watches it, it's the conversations that can be had here. I'm really happy that this movie exists. I'm happy that it's getting so much attention. And I really am wishing the best for the film as it goes forward and for you guys' career. I fingers crossed, maybe even some award consideration.
We're just happy to have it done and in the world, and that will settle for that. But hey, we'll see what comes. And Thomas, thanks for your good questions and sharing the word, sharing the news about the film. We appreciate it.